Welcome to Wisdom for Life, where we sit through philosophy to find practical advice that you can use in your everyday life. Hi, I'm Dan Hayes, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Greg Sadler, and today we're talking about
the trolley problem, or rather trolley problems in the plural. And we brought this topic up previously in episode 22, which focused on thought experiments, and we talked about several different types of thought experiments, the trolley problem being one of them. So now we're going to do a deeper dive. And the first thing that we have to talk about is, well, what is the trolley problem? Because I think a lot of people assume that they know exactly what it is, and this is not helped by popular culture. For example, The Good Place, where they tell you what the trolley problem with, and I actually put capital T, capital H, capital E in our show notes. It's not actually the single unique trolley problem, nor the even original one. So, we can think about, well, where do people get this idea from? Partly it's from pop culture, and we're going to talk a lot about that. And if you've ever had a intro to philosophy or an ethics class, you probably ran into the trolley problem. As a matter of fact, teaching those classes, I often have students bring up trolley problems to me, even if I don't bring them up myself, right? So there's a lot that we want to cover in this. Dan, do you want to talk about the conception of the trolley problem that is out there now? It's not the original one, but it's what should we call it? The predominant one.
Predominant one. The predominant one is that there is a trolley which is going down a track, and it's going down an incline, and the brakes fail. And also the conductor is also failed in that he is passed out, and you happen to be standing by on the side, and there is a switch that will change the trolley from the current track to another track. The problem is that the current track, if you do nothing, you stand by and, by act of omission, do nothing, the trolley goes down and hits and kills 5 people who just happen to be tied to the track. Or, I guess you could also
they could be standing
there's
around.
5 workers that are standing in front of the track, and they're so engrossed in their work that, they don't see the trolley coming. And if you switch the track, then it will switch to an adjacent track in which only one person will be hit and killed by the trolley. And, one of the biggest things with these types of thought experiments is that they are, really narrowly defined in order to try to elicit a specific conversation from the people that are talking about them. And, as Greg and I both know, that whenever you're in one of these, especially intro ethics classes, people try to wriggle out of these in any way possible. It's what if I had a boulder, or I could just push it, or they'd find any way to try to not actually have to deal with the dilemma that is faced. But that's the whole point of these.
And that's not just a problem with the trolley problem. It's any sort of thought experiment. There's something about human nature that's I want to screw with this. I want to, as Dan said, try to wriggle my way out of the confines. And it's a different thought experiment if you start adding in all sorts of provisos and so if you have 10 tracks, now it's not the original. Well, it's not even still the original trolley problem, but it's a less original trolley problem, if indeed still a trolley problem. And part of what we're going to...
The point here is to present a particular moral dilemma.
Yeah.
And a lot of times they're what is some way that I can make it so there is no dilemma at all? And now you've gotten away from the whole point of having the conversation in the first place.
Right. And it's sort of like that game that there was even a whole book out along these lines, almost like Mad Libs were when we were younger. Would you rather, right? Would you rather do A or would you rather do B? And it's a moral dilemma. There's some sort of ethical problem. It's not just would you rather eat worms or, I don't know, swallow slugs or something like that where it's just gross. It has to do with key ideas of ethics like rights or harms and benefits or duties or things like that. I did want to... go ahead.
Would you rather fight 100 duck-sized elephants or one elephant-sized duck.
Yeah. And then, somebody's going to say, well, I give the duck a cracker and now it likes me and now I'm no longer in the problem.
Right.
So one of the things that I came across in doing a little bit of show research for this was that even dictionaries get the trolley problem, as I put it here, adorkably wrong. Like the Merriam-Webster Online Dictionary frames it as a matter of utilitarianism, which is a word, versus deontologicalism, which is not a word, which, in a dictionary, using a word that's not a word, that seems to be a bit of a problem. So there's something about this that kind of gets people deranged. And, there is an original trolley problem, which we could, now this is an open topic. Should we call this the, capital T trolley problem because it's the original one? It's something quite different in which there's a trolley going down the tracks, like Dan just talked about, forcing you to choose between killing 5 or killing 1. But that's only part of the problem. And we find this articulated in an article in the 1960s by the great philosopher Philippa Foot. And then that's given fuller scope and interesting variants by Judith Jarvis Thomson, who's writing mostly in legal journals, but she's also an important philosopher. So we're going to talk about a lot of different things in this episode. We're going to do some intellectual history first, and then we're going to talk about some of the questions this raises, and then how this turned into memes. What kind of memes? These aren't actually Richard Dawkins memes. Even his notion of meme didn't hold still. And we're going to talk about a lot of the applications that people make of this. It's not all just conundrums in ethics classes or funny episodes on The Good Place or things like that. So Philippa Foot, right? She's a major moral philosopher of the 20th century, known for a lot of stuff besides the trolley problem, but this is something quite important. So this is where the first trolley problem comes from. She's not particularly interested in trolleys for their own sake. It's called the problem of abortion and the doctrine of the double effect. And so she's using these cases to try to think about, real life situations with abortion. And, she brings up the trolley as just one interesting idea. We should talk very quickly about double effect. Dan and I were kicking around how deep we should go into this. I think just one line from her thing is probably enough for illuminating it. And we can do a whole episode on this if people are really interested. So if you are, then, maybe write us or make some comments. She says the doctrine of double effect is based on a distinction between what a man foresees as a result of his voluntary action and what, in the strict sense, he intends. And so that's the core of the idea. There's a difference between foreseeing that your actions are going to lead to something and actually intending it. So, when you, for example, say something to somebody that needs to be said, you can foresee it's probably going to hurt their feelings, but that's not what you're actually intending to do. You might be intending to keep them from blowing their life savings in a get-rich-quick scheme, right? And right. So, we want to be able to make that kind of distinction. And that's what she was trying to aim at in this entire set of problems that she brought forward, some of which involve trolleys. Go ahead. You were going to...
It goes further into this of both the act and what the intention of the act is. If that direct intention is supposed to be good or bad,
yeah.
But also being aware of what any of these indirect results of these could be in themselves them bad. And so, if you are, once again, aiming for some good thing, even though you know that there's some bad thing that is going to happen, that is still in itself good.
The goodness of the good part is not eliminated, you might say, mm-hmm. by the accompanying or foreseen badness.
So, for example, because this is talking about abortion,
Yeah.
they're talking about a couple different examples of this. Under this doctrine, it is saying that if you're going to perform something that is directly causing the death of the child, even if it is to protect the mother, that would still be a bad because that is the direct intention. But if you're doing something that is to save the life of the mother, but indirectly causes the death of the child, that is a good thing. So, for example, this would be if they had a cyst on, or a cancerous tumor on their reproductive organs that had to be removed through a hysterectomy.
Yeah.
This is still a good thing, even though the ancillary effect is the death of this.
Another medical ethics case like that comes up when you have multiple children in gestation, and one of them is probably not going to make it, and they wind up being, a drain upon or a threat to the mother and the other children. I mean, that's a very difficult situation, but the doctrine of double effect allows you to say, in order to save the life of these others, and you could do it in kind of a utilitarian way where you're trying to maximize benefit, minimize harm. You can do that. So, and Foot was very interested in these kinds of cases, which were, 1967. This was becoming quite an issue in the Britain and America of her time.
And it might be again.
Yeah. So let's come back to her article. So. She talks about like the case of a judge who would execute somebody or subject somebody to execution in order to assuage a mob that would otherwise hurt people or kill other people. And then she brings up the trolley and she says, to make the parallel as close as possible, it may be supposed that he is the driver of a runaway tram. Notice a tram, not trolley, which he can only steer from one narrow track onto another. 5 men are working on one track and 1 man on the other. Anyone on the track he enters is bound to be killed. Now, notice there's no bystander at the switch. Mm-hmm. It's the guy running the trolley itself who has to make the decision. And the actual problem, the way that she frames it, is like this. The question is why we would say, without hesitation, that the driver should steer for the less occupied track, while most of us would be appalled at the idea that the innocent man would be framed by the judge for mob justice. And then she brings up another case to make this another set of cases to make this even more clear. We are about to give a patient who needs it to save his life a massive dose of a certain drug in short supply. There arrive, however, 5 other patients, each of whom could be saved by 1/5 of that dose. We say with regret that we cannot spare our whole supply of the drug for a single patient. We feel bound to let 1 man die rather than many if that is our only choice. So that's like the trolley problem, right? With the trolley problem, it's going down the track to hit somebody. In this case, with the drugs, people are going to die. The question is how you're going to apportion the death that's going to take place. And then she says, why then do we not feel justified in killing people in the interests of cancer research? Because, if you're going to follow this kind of like utilitarian reasoning, well, maybe it's okay to kill 1 person instead of, letting others die in their place, or to obtain. Here we're starting to get to the one that's going to become the hospital or surgeon example. Why can we not take spare parts for grafting onto those who need them? Or we could suppose similarly that several dangerously ill people can be saved only if we kill a certain individual and make a serum from his dead body. Now, Foot thinks that those cases are different. So on the one hand, we have trolley problems and, rationing drugs, or it could be rationing COVID vaccines or rationing antibiotics or anything else that we want. On the other side, we have cases where we actively kill somebody in order to save 5 other people by means of something, coming from their body. And she wants to say, why are these different from each other? Because she thinks that you and me and everybody else will naturally say, well, it's fine to change the course of the trolley, which turns out not everybody is cool with, right? And we're also all going to say, no, you can't, for example, take an innocent person and harvest their 5, organs from their body to save 5 people who need organs.
So
go ahead.
So she proposes another axes for us to look at this through a different way, another a prism, and to look at both through acts of omission and commission, but also through these ideas of positive and negative rights, which positive rights result in positive duties, and so that would result in a right to be positively benefited by another, and negative rights lead to negative duties, which lead to the right not to be harmed. Yeah,
you could think of go ahead.
And so, especially for the trolley problem, that we're standing on the side of the track, versus Philippa's version of the trolley problem, where you are in the conductor seat. Now you have 2 different ideas of what your rights are. As the actual conductor, you have a positive right to try to to actually steer the train in a way that reduces the loss of life. Whereas if you're just a bystander, you never had that positive duty enforced upon you because you were not in the position of actually being the train driver.
She doesn't actually consider the bystander at the switch. That's later with
you.
With
you are
Judith
correct.
Thompson.
This is, but she does specifically bring up these positive and negative rights. Maybe that's better exemplified in when she was talking about doing the difference between that and the framing a innocent person in order to stop a mob.
Yeah, who are going to kill 5 other people. And so, yeah, she sees these cases as qualitatively different from each other. And the real interesting question here is, there's actually several, because we can say, well, do people really view things the way that she does? And we're going to talk about that a little bit later when we get to the psychology and the experiments. As it turns out, no. But she says, okay, assume that people actually do see these as different from each other. Why are they different from each other? Let's provide a philosophical explanation, because a lot of people can have a gut sense that, oh yeah, these are different. I would decide this one differently than this one. But articulating it, that's a bit difficult to do. So this leads us to Judith Thompson, who is looking at it from a legal perspective. And she has a couple different articles, one of which is called Killing, Letting Die, and the Trolley Problem. And then she has one that's just called the Trolley Problem. And this is the one that I usually teach in my classes. And she is the one who's responsible for taking Foot's cases and then adding variants of her own to the mix and labeling them too. That's important in philosophy. You got to have a nice, catchy title. And so she coins the real iconic contemporary trolley problem, which is bystander at the switch. And she asks, why is it that the trolley driver can turn his trolley, though the surgeon may not remove the young man's lungs, kidneys, and heart? In both cases, 1 will die if the agent acts, but 5 will live who otherwise would die, which is a net saving of 4 lives. What difference in the other facts of these cases explains the moral difference between them? And, it's by manipulating the scenario that you can get to what the difference is. And she goes through kind of a cool, maybe it's this, no, it's not that, sequence of proposals before she finally settles on how it becomes okay to do one but not the other. And she proposes a lot of cool new cases. The bystander at the switch, the one that Dan narrated at the start, you're the one who actually controls which way the runaway trolley goes, whether you flip a switch or not. Now, flipping a switch is a positive action, letting the trolley run over people. You didn't make the scenario, right? And then there's Fat Man, where instead of having a switch, you're on a bridge, and you could push a fat man off that bridge, and he would stop the trolley. That's a bit different. She thinks that that's different than flipping a switch. Mafia guys on the track is another one. What if the 5 guys were actually mafiosos? And you would be, increasing the net happiness of the world by letting the trolley run over them. Should you not flip the switch then? Should you allow them to get hit? Then there's another one, and this is really quite contrived. A mayor makes a promise where there's 5 workmen on the track, and then there's a length of track where there's a guy eating, and he's eating there precisely because the mayor has told him that there will never be a trolley going down that track. So the mayor has made a promise to this guy, and the mayor is the one who has to decide. Do these change how we should answer the question? I mean, and I think with the mafia one, I mean, I'll tell you my take, and then I want to hear what your take is on this. Definitely. We let the trolley run over the 5 guys in that case. And because we don't, the one guy, he's just sort of neutral. What would you do?
So the immediate answer seems to be similar to yours, but then I'm like, okay.
They're human beings after all.
Well, more along the lines of what are the consequences? Like how far away can we take these consequences?
Okay.
And so we've got immediate consequences. You have 5 mafiosos die. Say they're big time in the mafia, and now you have a power vacuum, and now you've then started off a new
a whole set of wars. Power
between either vying factions of the mafia or 2 different criminal organizations, and does that actually cause more death and destruction by killing off these 5 because they were at least maintaining order in the criminal enterprise? It's really hard in that regard because if you're just going to contain it to that exact moment, but once you go a year down the road, it's really hard to see the effects that are going to happen.
Yeah, it becomes difficult to predict all the myriad different new timelines that it generates, you could say. Yeah,
right. But that's also true for any of these particular scenarios. You don't know what you don't know going down the track of these different potential histories.
That's quite true. And, and she brings in all sorts of other cool variants. I mean, if you haven't read the article, we'll put links to where you can find these in the show notes because they're well worth checking out. She's got some cool cases about doctors and patients in hospitals. I mentioned one so I'll narrate it. This guy's a doctor. He's got 5 patients. I think 2 of them need lung transplants. 1 needs a heart transplant.
2 need liver. 1 need heart.
Kidney.
I think.
No, 2 need kidneys.
Kidneys, yeah.
Yeah. And so, they're how it is with donor lists. They're just not going to get it, and they're all going to die that day. And in comes a healthy guy for his checkup, or maybe a flu shot, or whatever it's going to be. Nothing fatal. And the doctor says to him, listen, I got a conundrum here. I got these 5 patients. They're all going to die. You could really make a contribution here by letting me cut up your organs. Now, you would die in the process, and, but you would be really benefiting humankind. And then the guy says, no, I'm going to pass on that. I kind of like to live. And then the doctor says, oh, okay. And then he shoots him up with a drug or hits him over the head or whatever it's going to be. And he harvests his organs anyway. And he saves those 5 lives. Well, that's a net gain of 5 over 1, isn't it? And yet we should see this as morally repugnant. And then she goes into all sorts of other interesting things. Well, what if the doctor is actually responsible for these 5 people having organ failure because he gave them a drug a year ago that caused these organ failures? Now he's just kind of setting things right by taking this poor guy off the street and killing him. And, he is doing something objectively evil and wrong, but he's also, kind of balancing things out from his previous evil actions. How should we, think about that one is what she says. And there's other interesting things about, gases in a hospital that would kill patients being diverted. And, you can read these for yourself. It's quite ingenious, the things that she comes up with. The other thing that I do want to mention, this starts getting us into the pop culture land. She talks about the villains who create these situations, who tied the people down to the track, right?
Right.
And how should we look at them? Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like when I forget which movie it was. Maybe Dan, where Batman is facing off against, I think, Heath Ledger's Joker, and like there's people on one end of town that he can save, and people on which one was that? Do you remember?
That's
it's one of the Dark Knight ones, right?
The Dark Knight, and it's
the original
Joker
one?
has. Okay. No, it's the second one. It's Batman Begins, and then The Dark Knight is the second of the Nolan trilogy. Okay. And so we have Harvey Dent in one area, and then Rachel, Bruce Wayne's love interest, in the other. And they have him at the police station, and there's a number of different things. You have this dilemma and decision, and another thing the whole thing is that like Batman is like basically trying to torture the Joker out of telling him like what's going on and where I can go and save these people. And so there's a whole extra dilemma of like, should he be doing that even though it's going to result in like this benefit at the end? But what was the question especially is like it's also a flip because he does tell them where they are, but he flips where the actual locations are, and so he's giving him bad information even though it is true in one sense. He gives them the location but flips the who's where.
Showing that he is truly a villain. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Now, not Foot, but Thompson has a really weird consideration here. And when I read this piece, this is one of the places where I'm like, yeah, I don't know what she's actually doing with this. The idea is that you should not act in such a way as to improve the moral record, as she calls it, of a villain by choosing in such a way that the threat the villain imposes doesn't actually get enacted against the five. For me, I think you shouldn't worry about that. But she seems really quite concerned about that. Did you have any ideas about this passage where she's saying you shouldn't, improve the record of bad people?
That doesn't quite gel with me either. Like it's the bad person's action, and I can try to mitigate the damage that this bad person is doing, but it shouldn't be for the benefit of this villain. That's just to try to have a better outcome.
Yeah, I mean, maybe with some of these articles, it doesn't make that much sense to buy into everything that they say. And in order to get to the other stuff, because we're already getting a little bit long with this, I'll just mention part of her solution. She talks about what she calls a distributive exemption for rights. So when you're turning the trolley onto the track and running over the one person, you're violating their right to life, right? And she says that we can allow an intervention into the world to get an object that already threatens death to those many, instead threaten death to these few, but only by acts that are not themselves gross impingements on the few. So you can't use means that infringe stringent rights of the few in order to get their distributive intention carried out. And that's rather abstract. The idea is that you can, in fact, divert a danger that's going to kill many more people onto just a few people. So, she talks about avalanches as an example, right? If you can put one person in the course of the avalanche rather than 100, it's okay to do that. In that sort of case, you're allowed to violate their rights. You're not allowed to do it in other cases, like the poor guy who walks into the hospital, right?
Right. And I would throw in, like, there's also, like, role-based rights or role-based duties here, pulling in from a different set of moral axioms.
Yeah.
Look at the Hippocratic Oath. As a doctor,
good example.
The first duty is to do no harm, and obviously, intentionally killing one person in order to save the others is violating that original duty for the doctor.
Yeah, and I think we can come up with similar role. I mean, we can talk about like parents and children, maybe, and this is where it gets really tricky. What if it's diverting the trolley, from the 5 people who you don't know onto a track where your child is? I think a lot of parents would probably say, sorry, but I'm going to let it run,
Mm-hmm.
What do we make of that, So this is a good place to talk about how we get from the original stuff to the trolley problem that we all know and love and fear and argue about incessantly.
Well, quickly, I would just want to add one more duty. So the trolley conductor in Philippa's original version of this has 2 positive duties. One, not to hit the one person, and another duty not to hit the 5 person.
Yeah.
And so you have 2 equal duties, or at least equal category of duty, and then you can just quantify the amount of that. Whereas when we're talking about the bystander, you have removed that positive duty.
Yeah, the bystander at the switch is different, and this is why I think it becomes the trolley problem. So it gets reframed generally in terms of, is it okay to flip the switch or not? And that gets framed in terms of moral theories. So on the one side, if you do flip the switch, that's usually taken as representative of what we call consequentialist or even utilitarian thinking, where you're saying, I need to minimize the harm or maximize benefits. I need to have the better outcomes. And then there's deontological moral theories, and these could be that of Immanuel Kant, not using humanity as a means. It could be rights-based. It could be, other things. And those typically say, don't flip the switch. And the distinction that gets made there is, if I flip the switch, I'm doing something. Whereas if I don't flip the switch, even though I could have, I'm not actually doing something to those 5 people. I'm just letting things happen as they go. Now, I'm kind of curious, if we frame it only like that, do you flip the switch or not, Dan?
Oh, I flip the switch to 1 all the time.
Me too. Now, does that mean that we're utilitarians? Or... because that's the way a lot of people take it. You're either utilitarian or you're a deontologist.
Well,
how do you
I'm definitely a little bit of both. I guess sorry. This is the whole point of this being a dilemma, because it is it is trying to put you in a position. And I guess one of the kind of guiding lights for my personal morality is that if I see something that is right to do and it's costing me nothing to do it, then I should be doing that. And under the purely I don't know who these, there's just 5 versus 1 under that categorization of this particular problem, then I flip the switch.
For me, I'm basically a virtue ethicist, and a lot of people would take that as, well, you can't be utilitarian in any way then. And I kind of think, no, there's actually a lot of cases where where the right thing to do is to choose the utilitarian solution to something. Robert Audi actually has a really excellent article on this. He's a contemporary virtue ethicist, but he says that virtue ethics and even deontological ethics ought to use cost-benefit analyses when it makes sense to do so. So I think this is one of those cases where it's almost a no-brainer. 1 versus 5. I'm going to take the saving the 5.
Right.
Now, this becomes what we call Trolleology. It's a new term. And Frank Bosman wrote something interesting about this. He says, the rise of Trolleology resulted in the trolley problem leaving the exclusive realm of academic philosophy for the complex world of popular culture, where it gained fame for the masses but lost some of its original philosophical finesse. What do you think? Did it lose some of its philosophical finesse, or did it gain some in the process?
It definitely gained some silly things, but like, I'm a firm believer that silliness can lead to some actually interesting and deeper philosophical thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of other funny thought experiments, right? And the silliness that you're talking about, I mean, we've referenced The Good Place. I don't know if I'm sure the trolley problem comes up in some other essentially sitcoms, or I don't know if maybe The Good Place isn't a sitcom as such, but it's definitely a comedy. So
sure,
I think, and there is some silliness involved in it. And this is kind of interesting too. A lot of people are like, I'm not a fan of The Good Place because when I've watched the few episodes of it I watched, I found that the philosophy was a little bit too reductive, and I found the people a little bit, it kind of flip in the way that like the people who always want to, like, if they find out that you're into philosophy and they're like, oh, I've seen some Monty Python sketches, and you're like, yeah, that was funny like 30 years ago, but after the 20th time hearing the Philosopher song, I'm kind of over it. The Good Place for me was always kind of like that. I know they have a philosopher on staff, but that doesn't necessarily make it great. But on the other hand, it is bringing these ideas to not thousands, but millions of people who otherwise would not have encountered them. So maybe there's a good, utilitarian case there for these kinds of shows being the way in which we teach people philosophy.
I kind of think of it as, a really kind of dumbed down intro philosophy course.
Yeah.
At least for the first season or two. Then it gets into a little bit more. Like the first season specifically, that show is very much like, hey, let's like talk about like some high level ideas here.
Yeah.
And if you look at it as just a popularization of ideas that are a road that will lead to potentially greater understanding, then great. I think it's useful in that case. If we're talking about it being actually good, deep philosophy, I don't think it really gets there until the last season.
Okay.
But because the last season is basically the head philosopher on staff is basically his like dissertation and book.
Okay.
Trying to be realized.
See, as you were talking about it, I kind of thought, so The Good Place is sort of like the equivalent of and I'm putting this with air quotes, the cool professor who all the students like, but gives them kind of like watered down stuff, and he gets the great evaluations because he's joking around all the time in class, but he never really goes that deeply into the material. And then 10 years later, when you're at a party and you quote something that he told you and people are like, no, that's wrong. You feel kind of like a fool for having been taken in, but you didn't know any better because he was your professor. So.
Right. And we see this in other places where there's popularization of certain things. For example, is Ryan Holiday in the Stoicism community, which he's got some interesting stuff, but I wouldn't call most of it deep. But it has brought a lot of people into at least reading some of the more deep stuff that you can actually find in Stoicism. So I guess kudos to him for that particular achievement.
And I think the response that we could have as people who like have progressed further and want other people to progress further is it's great when it's the gateway drug, but it's bad when that's all people are going to be stopping with. If people take it as like, this is what Stoicism is, what Ryan Holiday is teaching, rather than, we'll pick another figure, rather than what Donald Robertson or Chris Gill is teaching, then we've got a problem, right? And so with the trolley problem, maybe we want to say something similar. We would like people to go deeper into it than just what these pop culture things are. Although the rest of the show, we're going to basically be talking about pop culture. So who are we to cast stones, right? I mean, do you want to talk about some of the psychological stuff? We have enough time for that, you think? Probably, right?
This experiment I put in here?
That, and we could also talk about the self-driving car issues. But yeah, tell us about this experiment that.
Okay, so in 2014, Natalie Gold, Andrew M. Coleman, and Brody D. Pulford did a study in Untitled Cultural Differences in Response to Real Life and Hypothetical Trolley Problems. And just as we're talking about like the differences in why certain people might choose one thing over the other, their idea was is there potentially a difference based on the cultural milieu that people grow up in how they respond to this particular problem. And so they had a couple of experiments with different formulations of the trolley problem, some that are more just financial based, but some that are actually, straight up the trolley problem.
Okay.
With about 200 people in it, and the major groups were a contingent of British people and a contingent of Chinese. And they found that there was a statistically significant difference in the response rates to flipping the switch or not, of which the Chinese, in comparison to the British, were regularly less likely to hit the switch, and a lot of the participants that did not choose to fit the switch, that were of specifically the Chinese contingent, gave fate as
interesting.
A major contributor to why they decided to do this. And so I guess this is a little bit out of partly Confucianism. I'm going to hold that back and say I don't know, but apparently the idea that they should not be interfering in the way that things are going to actually happen, that to let fate do its course was a strong indicator for why they would choose not to, whereas the British were much less likely to believe in fate and were more likely to flip the switches.
That's interesting. And I bet if we did similar experiments, we could find all sorts of variations, not only between like large scale, world cultures, but also maybe along class lines or maybe along gender lines or things like that,
Another response from that is the older that you got, the more likely you were to flip the switch.
Wow. See, now that's kind of counterintuitive, but that's an interesting finding. I'll bring up just a very short thing about another study that was carried out. They looked at the bystander at the switch. You flip the switch or you don't flip the switch, and the fat man, where you actually have to physically push the fat man off onto the tracks, thereby causing his death to stop the trolley. And they asked people who thought that these were, like, one's okay, the other one's not okay, for justifications. And they classified the justifications into sufficient justifications, that were ones that pointed out at least one difference between the two cases. Insufficient justifications where they failed to do that, so maybe saying that 5 lives are more important than one, but not explaining why. And then this is really interesting, discountable objections, which is kind of a code word for crazy, off the wall, has nothing to do with the case kind of objections, like a man's body cannot stop a train. I guess people trying to wiggle out of the story. And then they found out that once you got rid of the discountable, really out there objections, only 30% of the remaining justifications were sufficient justifications. People could partly articulate, but not very well, why they thought these were different, which is kind of a bad sign. I mean, if you can't explain why you should do the right thing, does that get in the way of doing the right thing some of the time? Probably so, right? Especially if there's more than one person involved in the decision making.
Right. This is basically the way that most humans make decisions, as we have kind of this instinct of what is right and wrong, and we just act on those. Or
we talk with other people, but we're kind of, inarticulate and saying, well, what do you think? What should we do?
Yeah. And there's not like a basis from which I'm building a actual decision.
Yeah.
But it's just like, well, I was raised up to, not hit anyone or not to push. And so maybe that was like one of those like intrinsic thoughts in you that was like, well, I shouldn't be pushing this guy. That violates a really, basic norm of society. I can't like exactly articulate that when we're talking about this particular thing.
Yeah. I mean, if people can't like prioritize between I shouldn't push people and I shouldn't push people into deadly, jeopardy or something like that, we're in real problems, right? Mm-hmm. So, well, let's talk about the self-driving cars thing, because I think this is kind of interesting. We're going to see a lot of technology with machines being called on to make decisions. And so MIT created something called the moral machine, not just a experiment, but a whole set of scenarios that you can find at moralmachine.net. And they were really interested in situations where it got a little bit more granular, where it wasn't just, 1 versus 5. They started saying, well, you got to hit somebody. Is it a woman or a man? Young person, old person, And then they even went to like lawful pedestrians over jaywalkers. Is it okay to like, if somebody's where they're not supposed to be, is it better to kill them than to kill somebody else? Or, humans over animals. There was another thing involved where a self-driving car could swerve to kill its passengers or save them by hitting various groups of pedestrians. Now, who should the car kill? I mean, those of us, there might be a little bit of class envy here. I mean, those of us who don't have a lot of money might say, well, obviously, if you're rich enough to afford a self-driving car, the car should kill you, rather than endangering other people whose lives, are not quite as good as yours. I doubt the driver would say that. What are you talking about?
Don't you know the people that have more money are inherently better people?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the way they definitely see it, right? Mm. So, and this is really interesting stuff. Have you ever played around on that site?
Yeah, it's crazy. Like you get like a woman and her child versus like 2 nuns.
Yeah, it gets really specific, doesn't it?
Right, and you'll add in like pets and stuff, and like it's trying to find that line, but like. The same problem exists here that we were kind of like talking about when I was talking about this British versus Chinese.
The role stuff. Well, the role stuff too.
Roles, but I'm talking about specifically that like different cultures might have different answers to these things. Oh. It's not like there's some perfect line in the sand that will suffice for every single group, and I assume that the most people that are using the moral machine are probably Western and fairly affluent because they're on this website.
Well, they're my students because I have them play around with it too when we do ethics classes. And when I do it in the context of utilitarianism. Like when we're in that unit, I'm like, hey, you should check this out. And some of them do. It's kind of an interesting quandary, right? There's a really great passage that we've got here too from Carl Yagnama, Yagnama. Boy, I'm having trouble with pronouncing things. Anyway, he says, even if trolley problems were a realistic concern for autonomous vehicles, it's not clear what, if anything, regulators or companies developing these should do about them. The trolley problem is an intensely debated thought experiment precisely because there isn't a consensus on what should be done. So if that's really the case, maybe this moral machine stuff is not going to be as helpful as we'd like.
Right. But interestingly, there's this other paper trolled by the trolley problem on what matters for ethical decision making in automated vehicles.
Oh, right.
By Alexander G. Meering and Alexander. Yes. I'm not even going to try. It starts with them. You can find it for yourself. In which they come through, at least in this paper, to 4 kind of competing solutions. Either you try to find some perfectly utilitarian valuation of all potential deaths and choose the course that results in the highest value of the living, which seems like a really difficult task, especially on the fly, and you're going like 60 miles an hour. It's like, how do you calculate the value? Another one is to try to find the least undesirable choice is the best choice, usually through just the amount of death that is made. Another one is, sidestep the utilitarian and move it to a more intentions-based choice. Make a decision based on saving lives, knowing that some death is going to happen either way. So we're trying to just optimize for saving lives. Mm-hmm. But their final conclusion is basically, once again, a sidestepping of the trolley problem, in which they say, okay, trolley problems are vanishingly small. In the real world, they can still happen, but instead of trying to solve the trolley problem with our limited resources, to try to put the vehicles in the situation in order to reduce ever having to find a solution to the trolley problem in the first place.
That reminds me of something that Alistair McIntyre points out. Alistair McIntyre is a great contemporary virtue ethicist, and he's got a paper on not on trolley problems, but on moral dilemmas. And he says, do moral dilemmas really exist? Some people say they don't. And he says, no, they really do exist. There are some cases where you have to choose between 2 evils or 2 goods, and it's really difficult to choose between them. But he points out that whenever we actually have a genuine moral dilemma, we have a real problem in the present, but that's because something got seriously screwed up in the past. Somebody made bad decisions along the way. And now there's not much we can do about that, but this sidestepping idea that you're articulating here, it's sort of like saying, in the future, let's try to make sure that there's less moral dilemmas. And I think that's a great idea,
Right.
If we can do it.
Yeah. Have the cars drive slower.
Yeah. That might be a
building infrastructure
great idea.
that helps to potentially reduce the chance of having pedestrians and cars interacting in the first place. There's lots of other things that we can do to reduce these things to happen, and that might be, if we're talking about how do we, in kind of a utilitarian sense, save lives or have the most good, maybe spending more time on that is what will actually give us the best outcome.
Now, we're gonna talk very briefly about actual trolley problem memes, and you can just Google trolley problem memes and they'll come up. We don't have to try to tell you where to find them or stuff like that. But what you're saying reminds me of one of the memes that we selected, actually one of the ones that you picked out, where it's not a real trolley problem. There's a trolley, there's a single track, and there's a whole bunch of people tied to the track, and it says you can stop the trolley problem at any time, but doing so would disrupt the trolley service, causing the company to lose profits, right? And so you can flip the switch if you want the company that's not paying you anything to lose profits. And there would definitely be some Americans who'd be like, nope, free marketplace, got it, can't stop it. Got to let it go, There's another one that's kind of similar to that, where it shows like the trolley having run over a whole bunch of people before, and then there's a whole bunch of people in front, and it says, is it really fair to stop the trolley? Is that fair to the people who are already run over to not run over these other people? And of course, the intelligent person's answer would be, yes, let it stop the trolley. But
I believe that one's called the boomer trolley problem.
Oh, that
because
is
it's like, I went through this, so you have to go through this. And it's like, no, let's just fix the problem.
Yeah. I think I may have brought this up in the past, but when I was in basic training, which sucks. there were people who were like, man, when I have rank, I'm never going to treat my soldiers this way. And then there were some people who are like, I can't wait to make rank so I can make somebody else suffer. You know?
I love the one that you picked up.
What were some of the other memes that you particularly liked?
So the Veil of Ignorance trolley problem has, you don't know where you'll be in the trolley problem. It's a regular trolley problem, but you can either be, in the end, you're going to either be one of the 5 guys, you're going to be one of the 1 guy stuck in the track, you'll be in the trolley itself, or you can be the one in the switch. And this is from the Veil of Ignorance from, remind me.
John Rawls, yeah.
John Rawls, yes. Rawlsian
Rawls
Veil
is
of Ignorance.
A theory of justice.
Right. So you don't know where you're going to be in the trolley problem. However, you have the choice you have to choose a scenario in advance regarding personal interests. Would you like to have the lever pulled? So you don't know if you're going to be on the track or not. Do you have the person pull the lever or not?
If you just think about it in a statistical way, you're most likely to be one of the 5 tied to the track. So I would say, yes, you do want the lever pulled, right?
Right.
If you wind up being the person in the trolley, you don't care because you're going to, run over people no matter what. The person at the switch, he's actually, in this case, he doesn't have any responsibility. He's just being told what to do. Right.
He's got no agency.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I guess the whole point of the Veil of Ignorance is that we all make a decision together before we even go into the situation. So we all have, voted for how we're going to respond. Yes. Yeah. So there is some agency even for the guy who's pulling the switch, even though the decision was already made.
That's true. So there's one that came up in McSweeney's, the internet comedy site, called the Meta-Ethical Problem. And so I'm going to read this, and then we might have time to do a little. Actually, we probably won't have that much time.
Yeah.
I'll just read it. There's an out-of-control trolley speeding towards Immanuel Kant. You have the ability to pull a lever and change the trolley's path so it hits Jeremy Bentham instead. Jeremy Bentham clutches the only existing copy of Kant's groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. Kant holds the only existing copy of Bentham's, the principles of morals and legislation. Both of them are shouting at you that they have recently started to reconsider their ethical stances. These are the, utilitarian and deontologists, the big granddaddies of both of those theories. So this is just ingenious. I love this one.
Oh yeah. Like it just hits on so many perfect levels. And then the last one, and they're both reconsidering their ethical stances is woo.
Yeah. And, it's getting you with a double whammy, right? Because so if you save Bentham, he's got the existing copy of Kant's groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, which then you could read and you could see what Kant has to say about it. So either way, you kind of save both of them, don't you?
Except for if they're changing their stances, they might not tell you what they had originally written because they no longer hold to it.
All right. Yeah. That's and they're shouting at you. That's great. Well, I don't think we have time for any more of them. So why don't you lead us out on a last final thought?
So today we leave you with the words of Kwame Anthony Appiah. Being deluged with trolley problems is one of the professional hazards of modern moral philosophy.